Welcome and thank you for joining us today to discuss our program in Cuba, hosted by our resident director, Angelica Salazar. My name is Shannon Peak Bernardo, and I am the Assistant Director of Student Services, as well as one of the program managers for Cuba. We will also be joined by our Director of Health, Safety, and Security, Maureen Gordon, later in this presentation. For those of you who might be less familiar with us, the College of Global Studies is one of the 3 colleges of Arcadia University located in Glenside, Pennsylvania. We facilitate study abroad programming for our students and yours, with 130 different opportunities throughout the world. Today we are highlighting our fantastic programming in Cuba and how we can support you and your students in this exciting opportunity. I'm pleased to introduce our resident director, Angelica Salazar, who will share some information about herself and introduce our program in Havana, Cuba.
Hello, hola, bienvenidos. I want to give you all a warm greetings. I know some of you might be in very cold parts of the country today, so welcome to our Cuba program, and it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you, and looking forward to sharing about our program. So before we start, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about myself as the resident director of our program. I have a long and beautiful relationship with the island nation of Cuba and the people. My first trip to Cuba was in 1996. So not to age myself, but I was 14 years old on my first trip to Cuba, and I've been traveling and living in Cuba for the past 4 years. My first trip led then to several other trips that focused on a number of different exchanges along with my parents, along with people-to-people groups, and then had the truly incredible transformational experience of studying and living in Havana, Cuba as a young person in the summer of 2001. This very same intensive, immersive language course that our students take in the Arcadia program, I was also once in their shoes during that summer. The difference is that I did not have a program set up for me, and so my parents offered to help facilitate my homestay with some friends that they had met in that very first trip in 1996. And I went down on a religious license. I studied Spanish. I took vocal dance classes, and I learned a lot about myself during that summer. Later in 2003, I landed my first job, my first professional job rather, as a community college transfer student with the U.S. NGO, specifically working around reconciliation, the normalization of relations between Cuba and the United States. And that's where I really learned and became impassioned by understanding the complexity of our relationship between Cuba and the United States. And then for about a decade or so after that, continued this body of work, working with a number of important U.S. organizations, leading national grassroots advocacy work, both in D.C. and outside of D.C., and then later in U.S.-Cuba medical cooperation. I had the true pleasure of facilitating a number of people-to-people trips to Cuba. And then right after grad school, I began to work with a U.S. organization that's partnered with the Martin Luther King Center, which is a well-respected, deeply community-involved organization based in Havana, Cuba. And I was able to facilitate the custom-led and co-designed, co-led programs for hundreds of U.S. Americans in Cuba. So Cuba is an island and people dear to my heart, and so it's really just an honor to be able to work with Arcadia and continue this mission and work with our students there, both in our semester and summer program. Also, Cuba is an extremely complex nation. I've been traveling there for 22 years now, lived there for the past 4 years, and I say every day in Cuba I learned something new. And I thought I knew something and then realized I actually didn't really know it. And there's many layers to the complexities, but that's the beauty of Cuba. And also understanding the true resilience and solution-based people and nation that Cuba is. So with that, and those years of experience and deep relationship on the island, I've of course developed a strong community and communities within communities on the island, and so that's really where I love to be creative in our program and sharing those communities with our students and those exchanges, those two-way exchanges that I facilitate. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about community engagement and deeper into our program. But a little bit about our program's history in Cuba. So our program signed the first agreement in 2012, which doesn't seem like that too long ago, but actually it is in terms of diplomatic relations with Cuba. In 2012, our program was signed and we had our first group on the ground in the spring of 2013. So we are actually the first U.S. use provider to have a year-round program. So we also with that, we should be proud to say that I'm the second resident director of our program. And so actually my predecessor was the founding groundwork building this program. And so we want to be proud and to consider the longstanding relationship that we have in Cuba, and especially in Cuba, that's recognized. So our partnership is really critical to us and the work that we do. We're partnered with the University of Havana. The University of Havana was founded in 1728. It is actually the oldest on the island and one of the oldest universities in the Americas. It's a prestigious university. It has 16 colleges and it has numerous centers of studies. And one of those really critical and prestigious centers of studies is our key partner on the island, CEHSEU, the Center for Hemispheric and United States Studies. Given my background in U.S.-Cuba policy work and advocacy, obviously that was something that when I saw the Arcadia program, it drew me to it, that our students actually get to study in Cuba and learn firsthand perspectives from the specialist on U.S.-Cuba relations. It's the only Cuban institution that specializes in U.S.-Cuba relations. So with that said, the professors that teach our students both in our semester and summer program are the premier specialists. They're the ones when you turn on Mesa Redonda, the round table, literally, and you hear these academic and political debates, they're at the table. And so they're also at the table with our students, going through our cornerstone course, which is an intensive course that focuses on the past and present of Cuba, but also looking through the historical and sociocultural, lenses and contexts as Cubans and as specialists on the island. It's a very different perspective than maybe some of our students have received in some of their history or other courses related to Cuba in the United States. So this course is required both in our summer and our summer programs. The difference is in our semester program, this course is taught in Spanish, and in the summer, it's taught in English. This program, this specific course rather, it provides our students a seminar-like course where our professors are providing readings and having our students dialogue and participate and think critically on the subject matter. And so this often propels our students and inspires them to take the midterms and final presentations that they have to then carry it on into their senior thesis work. And in some cases, actually in several where I've helped facilitate students with gathering qualitative research, data, and so forth on the island, they're actually doing their graduate work later based off this, this course that help provide that space for them, that academic space. So our semester program, as I jump into that, our students are taking the cornerstone course as well as 2 to 3 electives in the following departments. In the Department of History, Philosophy, and Sociology, and listed are some of the courses that students can take, as well as the Department of Arts and Letters. And then our students also take an intensive language course in which they're placed in at their appropriate level. And if students, for example, are heritage Spanish speakers or feel fluent enough, they can then take 3 electives versus that Spanish language course. So I just want to point out that our semester program does have a requirement of 4 semesters Spanish language proficiency, and that's really because our students in the semester program are direct enrolled in the University of Havana. They are sitting in classrooms with Cuban students along with other international students representing up to 88 different countries. At some point, they have German students, Turkish students, Angolan students. And so it's a very international experience, but they're being taught by Cuban professors. So they do need to be proficient in the language to have all of these courses taught in Spanish. Just some of the examples, I've had a biology major from Georgetown. She was able to meet her requirement, her biology major, by taking a course in the philosophy department at the University of Havana, and that was a course on bioethics. And she just loved that course, and then also decided she wanted to become a Spanish minor because of her semester abroad at the University of Havana and taking the language requirements. I've had students at Temple and other schools who were journalist majors who then took courses at the Department of Communication because that was the requirement. And so she was able to expand out and take a course on history of the press in Cuba in the Department of Communication, which was a really exciting opportunity. And several other students jumped on that as well and started taking that course with her. And then just briefly to go over our summer program, unlike her semester program, they don't direct enroll, but they do take that U.S.-Cuba relations course taught in English, and they take a 2-week intensive Spanish language course with an option of a 3rd week. And so this is like our semester program. This is an intensive, rigorous academic schedule, but both semester and summer program, we provide a lot of extracurricular activities, cultural activities, weekend excursions, and so forth. So I'm going to explain a little bit about the opportunities that we provide students in those areas as well throughout this session with you today. So briefly, our Arcadia Excursions, which are both in our semester and our summer program. The difference is during the semester, of course, we have a lot of time to build in on travels and, building in an opportunity for students to customize their experience, whether they're taking dance or joining the Caribbean games in the spring and sports teams and so on. We also provide our Arcadia program is a week-long excursion across the island. So here's a map of the island. We start in Havana and we travel all the way to Santiago de Cuba and back. So it's a long island. So that's why we need a week. We also travel with a professor from the Department of History at the University of Havana, who's very enthusiastic about these journeys across the islands with students. Him and I co-design and co-facilitate, but he's really the guide. He is the expert on history of his country. And then we also include on these excursions opportunities to see outside of the big cities and learning more about Havana, its diversity, in rural towns, to the diversity in how Spanish is spoken throughout the island, right? Camagüey speaks very different than Santiagueros, right? There's a different flow of the language. And so this is an opportunity for students to also engage and listen more carefully and comprehend more the Spanish that they're learning during the semester. So this is an adventurous trip during the semester that we take. We have 2 drivers and an air-conditioned bus. We're visiting small towns. We're visiting cultural projects. We're visiting national parks. We're hiking. We are visiting museums, and we're experiencing the diversity of Cuba. Because I always say there are many Cubas within Cuba, right? And so maybe how one person thought in Havana might be thinking very different in Cienfuegos. And so this is an opportunity for students to explore that. At the bottom of this map, I included a link to one of the national parks that we visit on another excursion, which is to the Bay of Pigs, Playa Girón, as it's known in Cuba. We also do this excursion both in the summer and in the semester. Unfortunately, in the summer, we don't have time to do the week-long trip, so we do this as our one-day excursion to Playa Girón, and in both cases, both programs, we invite professors from the University of Havana, our specialist program, CEHSEU, to then accompany our students on a day-long guided, fully educational day of visiting not only the Museum of the Bay of Pigs of Playa Girón, but also cultural projects like Corimacao, for example, where they get to exchange with young people their age that are from all over Cuba who are not just training, but working as artists and hired by the Cuban state to bring their art across the island. And so we learn about cultural projects, we learn about the flora and fauna that are endemic and that are really precious to this region. We also experience the Cuban crocodile, as well as birds and other floral that is really just an opportunity for students to take a break from the big city and be in nature. So here are a couple of the photos. In your left, we have our professor, Benito, and he's there with some of the students in Trinidad learning about the history of sugar in the region and the impact that it's had on the Cuban identity, to say. In the middle, you have the pilgrimage for many Cubans, that is El Cobre. That's the Our Lady of Charity, which is the patron saint of Cuba. That's her church there in Santiago de Cuba. And to your right, you see us just stopping along the side of the road and soaking up all of the countryside. So as you can see, we definitely make our journey across the island. And in your far left top, you'll see Professor Ernesto Dominguez, specialist in U.S.-Cuba relations, often travels to the United States to give lectures, has been to Arcadia as well to spend time, because we do have a two-way exchange with our program. So we invite Cuban scholars, including Ernesto and others from CEHSEU, to spend time at Arcadia. This is in front of the Bay of Pigs invasion, and he's giving a lecture. So while our students are in courses learning about this stuff and hearing stories and testimonies, we're actually visiting the locations where these historical sites took place. And we're dancing and enjoying ourselves everywhere we go. So the Sanduga Dance School in Santiago. So our students got to learn how they dance in Habana. And so, of course, we have to learn how they dance in Santiago. And importantly, our students are learning life skills, right? So while we're in our academic programs and while we're doing excursions, and I'll talk more about community engagements and other co-curricular, our students are also learning life skills. And so I'm going to go ahead, before I dive deeper into the, when our students arrive and the actual journey that follows, I'm going to pass off to my colleague Shannon, who will discuss more about the support and structures in place that we provide our students before they leave for Cuba.
Thank you, Angelica. One of the hallmarks of an Arcadia program is our dedication to student support. During the application and pre-departure phases, students work with a dedicated program manager to assist them through the various stages of preparing to study abroad in Cuba. A primary focus of our work is to support students with application documentation collection, ensuring their documentation is as strong as possible and will be accepted by the University of Havana. We read through student essays, recommendations, and other things to ensure that our students are all going to be fully accepted and having a successful semester abroad. Students in the semester, as Angelica mentioned, do need a proficiency level of 4 semesters of Spanish or the equivalent because of the direct enroll electives they take. We assess this through various materials that students are required to submit. Summer has no minimum language requirement, so their materials are submitted in English, and this offers students the opportunity to engage in this program who don't have that language proficiency. In addition to guiding your students, we're also here to answer the questions of advisors and parents as you work with your students going abroad. In terms of accreditation for the program, Arcadia University is Middle States accredited, and all students will receive an Arcadia University transcript upon completion of the program. Our registrar will translate the credits and grades from the Cuban system to the US A through F 4.0 GPA scale so that your offices might more easily apply the credits to your student's degree path. Program managers help students understand their course options and the course selection process at the University of Havana as well. As mentioned previously, there are very selective opportunities for semester students, and the credit weighting in Cuba is different, as you might imagine, so we assist students with planning for a full course load. Another major advising point that we cover is the academic differences that your students can expect in Cuba and how to prepare to be successful. We also assist students with credit transfer at their home institutions, working with you to provide support for pre-approval when course documentation is limited. Syllabi in the US sense are not often available in Cuba, so we are always amenable to reaching out to your offices or faculty to provide the Cuban context for why credit equivalencies cannot always be determined prior to the student's participation in the program. Another part of our advising philosophy is that the application process can be used as a teaching tool for life skills that will be utilized beyond the program and graduation. For all students studying on this program, the program managers conduct a telephone interview with the students to learn more about their goals and motivations for participating in the program. For semester students, this is conducted in Spanish to also assess their speaking ability. Each student on an Arcadia program is invited to a virtual pre-departure orientation. This is an opportunity for students to meet one another prior to leaving for the program, as well as providing a specific space to ask questions to enhance their preparation for life in Cuba. All students attending our program are also given a program guide that provides preliminary information on everything from monetary systems to transit options to our recommendations for the best place to grab a cajita for lunch near the university. In collaboration with our resident director, the program managers regularly update the guide and incorporate the feedback of returned students. This program guide is given prior to the pre-departure orientation and frames the content of that engagement. Another support service we provide is visa and flight support. We apply for visas on behalf of semester students directly with the Cuban Embassy in Washington, D.C. For students studying in the summer, we provide extensive instructions for applying for their visas associated with the identified group flight. Arcadia program managers identify a single flight for all students to purchase independently each term, which can alleviate any travel ambiguity for you and your offices. Finally, every student on an Arcadia program is asked to complete a personal health and self-care form. These forms help us collect volunteered information from students about their health and well-being and what support they might want overseas. This is particularly important for students going to Cuba, as health services abroad might take additional preparation or expectation setting for students. Program managers review all health forms prior to departure to prepare students alongside our Director of Health, Safety, and Security, Maureen Gordon, who will further detail our commitment to those fields at Arcadia in general and specifically in Cuba.
Thanks, Shannon. I just want to talk a little bit about Arcadia's approach to health and safety, generally speaking, and then we'll dive into how that applies specifically in Cuba. So our approach is really one of common sense. We do everything possible to prevent issues from happening with any of our students. But of course, we have emergency plans and protocols in place to respond quickly and appropriately for the inevitable times that they do. All of our staff, both in the US and abroad, are trained on our emergency protocols and incident response. And I think one training in particular that's worth mentioning is that all of our staff have received a certification for mental health first aid, including Angelica as the resident director for Cuba. So our approach really is one that prioritizes student learning as much as possible. And a little bit later in the presentation, we'll talk about a case study that I think highlights that. As I believe is that is something that sets Arcadia apart from other programs, especially. It's really, our approach is comprehensive. So Shannon described our pre-departure support, and we work really hard to align that with our on-site orientation and everything that's happening in country. As you know, our students are often overwhelmed with the amount of information that we're getting. So when it comes to the important stuff like health and safety, we we believe that some information bears repeating, sometimes multiple times. And so I think the student interview that Shannon mentioned is also critical because that really sets the tone specifically for Cuba and some of the things I'll talk about on the next slide. Our approach is definitely collaborative in the sense that I work and my team work very closely with Angelica, with the program managers, and as well as with our partner institutions in the US. So you can see on the slide, I'm pictured with Tim Barton, our Director of Student Life, and Kara Amaratis, our Assistant Director of Health and Safety. So the three of us together form the emergency response team for the college, and we are in regular, sometimes daily communication with Angelica about what's going on the ground, and oftentimes looping you as the student's advisor in on what's going on so that home institutions can be informed, involve you as much as you'd like, and you know, if there's anything ongoing, provide support to the student once they're back on campus. In terms of incident reporting and response, we are also, Arcadia as a full college and university in the States is subject to the same reporting obligations and compliance obligations that any of your institutions are subject to. So we're compliant with the CLEAR Act, of course. And I think in particular, one thing that's also worth mentioning is that we, myself and Tim are both trained Deputy Title IX coordinators for the university. So in the event that we would have anything that falls under that sexual misconduct umbrella happen on site, Angelica is immediately looping myself or Tim in so that we can respond appropriately to support the student and walk them through their options and in any sort of process that they need to go through. So I linked on this slide, you can see we have a guide for US partners that goes into more depth about all of the things I mentioned and a lot of the things we'll talk about today. Do feel free to download that. And another item worth looking at is our student handbook, which is available on our website and goes into more detail about our approach to health and safety in terms of how the information that's student facing, as well as our Title IX policy, our student code of conduct, academic policies, and some other things that would be applicable to your students. So moving forward, we can talk a little bit more specifically now about Cuba. So all of our students in Cuba and on all of our programs have comprehensive health insurance and political evacuation natural disaster coverage through GeoBlue and Drum CUSAC. So that basically means that any medically necessary care or mental health treatment is covered under the program, including evacuation and repatriation and all the things that most schools want to ensure that their students have that basic level. In Cuba in particular, students also have Cuban insurance that covers them specifically. So in Cuba, you know, Shannon mentioned a little bit about looking at students' health forms and we work very closely with individual students if they disclose a pre-existing condition to make sure that they'll have whatever care they need while they're in Cuba. So the international clinic, I'll ask Angelica to talk about in just a second, but just to mention that has been more than adequate for our students and serving student needs. They have a good quality of care. And they have been really great for any sort of unpredictable thing that can come up with students. In terms of mental health coverage or mental health care, I should say, that is a bit more of a challenge on the island because it's difficult to come across English-speaking mental health professionals. And so what's worked really well in the past for some of our students is telecounseling, which is available through GeoBlue. So Angelica, I don't know if you want to mention anything about the clinic and what that looks like.
Sure. Thank you, Maureen. Yeah, I just wanted to say that for both our semester and summer program, our students receive equally the intense, comprehensive, hands-on, in-practice orientation. So critical to that, and where we always start, is really from what Shannon and our program managers at Arcadia send me, having an understanding of the students before they arrive. So knowing what their dietary restrictions are, to whatever kind of wellness management and plan that we need to have in place when they get there, from when they arrive. So our orientation goes really in depth around health, safety, and security, and that starts on day one, We talk about our emergency protocol. We talk about Title IX. Often students themselves share their experiences in reporting Title IX, navigating just living in a big city. Some of our students come from rural colleges and campuses, and so what that looks like, to also how to navigate and how to combat really catcalls, sexual harassment, to setting a norma, kind of a way of communicating what our needs are and how we're going to contribute to the group during the semester or the summer. Understanding that we all come from diverse lived experiences with intersecting identities, and so addressing that all from the very beginning in orientation. Part of orientation, I also take the students to Sierra Garcia, the international clinic, where we meet with a representative there, and I walk them through what it looks like if they need to come in on their own. However, I always, take the students should they need me, and generally, absolutely in the first month to any of their visits that they may need, from experiencing upset stomachs, to common colds. And fortunately, I haven't had to deal with any serious matters, but we know that there is a healthcare system in place that's effective, that's accommodating, and that supports our students. And so I walk them through the process of Sierra Garcia, the insurance, and then also setting up a plan of communication on the ground with our students. So all of our students have access to a Cuban cell phone, which they can call home, they could call me, they could text me, and they have various ways of communicating should they need me. We also have Wi-Fi at the residence, and so that also helps to provide students the independence and flexibility should they need telecounseling or just a phone call to friends and family for support.
So just to get back quickly to mention that in terms of safety and security in general, Cuba and Havana comparatively are relatively safe. There's no significant crime or incident trends to point to. So for Cuba, we really advise students, similarly as we would for other countries in Europe, maintain a low profile, understand and follow differences in local law. And really the things that can become the most challenging for students are the cultural differences that we already talked about, and some of the strategies we've already talked about for setting expectations and helping them through some of those challenges. So one risk in particular that's certainly worth noting, and that we'll talk about on the next slide, John, if you want to move forward, is the possibility of hurricanes. As we all know, in the Caribbean and in Florida, there have been an increasing number of hurricanes in the fall semester, or the fall months, I should say, in the last few years. And so we had a very interesting experience last fall when Hurricane Irma was approaching the island, and thought it might be useful to talk here with this audience a little bit about how we thought about that, how we made our decisions, and sort of what that looked like on the ground. So I'll give a very brief intro and hand it over to Angelica to talk about the more exciting aspects of that experience. As the hurricane approached, our team here in the U.S. office was obviously carefully monitoring the news and the weather forecasts. Our crisis response team convened, which consists of the folks that I mentioned on the previous slides, as well as Angelica and our VP, our COO, and some of our other leadership teams. And so we really very carefully considered what the options were in front of us. And because we don't have time to go into too much depth about what that looked like here on this webinar, we could probably do a whole separate webinar about that. I'll just say that we were confident in the end that the best and safest option for our students was to shelter in place at the student residence where they lived. So with that, I think it's also important to know that we had a very structured communication plan in place between Angelica and myself. And that allowed us to know what was happening, to feel confident that the students were supported through this situation. And I was communicating regularly back with parents and advisors here in the States to make sure they were kept up to date. So you can see on the slide some positive feedback from one of the parents of our fall students. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Angelica to just talk about what happened in Havana during the hurricane.
Sure.
Although it was a tropical storm when it actually hit.
So I think, Maureen, you're right. We could actually do a separate webinar on just lessons learned and best practices, because ultimately Arcadia, of the handful of U.S. programs and providers that, literally a handful that are operating study abroad programs in Cuba, we were one of two that decided to stay. And I'll talk more about our residents in some next slides, but I think I need to highlight that the critical part is that the infrastructure that Arcadia has with our health, safety, and security team that's connected to our drum CUSAC and others, and also our team on the ground. Our partners, the University of Havana, CEHSEU, our colleagues at the Center for Hemispheric and United States Studies, around the clock, days before, during, and after, we were in communication. They came physically to the home to check on the students, to see how, their vibe was, to check in with any of their concerns, but also to address that Cuba really is an example in terms of disaster preparedness and recovery of what is an example of best practice, right? And so with that said, we put into practice our emergency protocol, as well as knowing that critical to moments like that is to being prepared, right? And so our residents, our landlords had food and water supply to last us a month. We had access to a generator. We had communication both on Cuban cell with a backup to my US cell phone on hand. We had our landlines, and we had around the rock and clock communication with our colleagues at Arcadia and at the University of Havana. We also had a stream of communications with the U.S. Embassy so that they knew that we were there, and we felt really supported. And one thing I just want to highlight on this is that the students themselves, our students of the fall 2017 group, which you see here, packing up leaves with their neighbors some days after the storm, they themselves, they knew they didn't have the final say-so on if they were being evacuated or where they'd be evacuated to, after much consideration when we told them that we would be staying and what the plan was. They had a sense of relief because they knew that they were safe, and they knew that they were supported, and they knew that they were in the safest country to be if a storm was coming. They also felt a sense of solidarity, which I really just want to express through the line today, and a commitment to staying in Cuba. Our semester students really immerse themselves, and part of that is the collective experience, right? So experience, observing, and then participating locally in the cleanup. Our students were recognized by the University of Havana, by CEHSEU, for their efforts in the cleanup after the tropical storm of Hurricane Irma that hit Havana. And so this picture really defines that, and just the round-around communication from our team on the ground to our Arcadia team in Glenside to all of you who might be on this call that received an update if they had a student to their offices. So there was just a lot of communication, and especially to our students' families. They had their phones topped up, so they were making phone calls to the home and assuring their families that they were safe and sound. And we watched plenty of movies and had actually, we celebrated one birthday in that week that we hunkered down, and our kind, just the most thoughtful landlord, Lorenzo, which I'll talk more about in a couple next slides, he actually made the students' favorite meal, which is hamburgers. Go figure. So we had hamburgers during the storm and watched plenty of movies. So let's go ahead and move forward. So briefly, our residence, as you can see, is really beautiful. It's in the neighborhood of Beidado. It's a 20-25 minute walk, depending how fast you walk and how hot it is during the day, to the main campus of the University of Havana. It is very centrally located. So it's between Calle 23 in Linea, So you can walk to either one and then take maquinas, the shared taxis, to just about anywhere in Havana. But in orientation, our students also get a breakdown on the local bus system, the Wawas. And so our students get on public transportation. They know how to put their backpacks in front of them on the bus and to snuggle in. But they also learn the bus routes. And so having a residence that's centrally located is a sense of relief for me as the resident director. But we also have a ton of restaurants, nightlife, cultural projects, just walking distance from the residence. Our students live very comfortably. Oftentimes our students arrive and their jaws drop and it's beyond their expectations just how beautiful their rooms are, how spacious this place is, and how much outdoor common space there is to study, as well as the meal plan. So our students eat very well. After a week with them during the tropical storm, I saw just how well they eat. They are offered 2 meals a day, breakfast and dinner. Our resident landlord, Lorenzo, and his wife, Ruti, take very good care of our students. Lorenzo is a chef and offers the opportunity for students to help prepare the meals so that they can learn those life skills of cooking. And so our students are able to come with their various diverse dietary restrictions, and we're able to provide them healthy, balanced, and nourishing food. So that's always an important part so that our students can focus in and study well during their semester or summer. As you can see, this is some of the slides. It's a common area, and then in the patio, it goes all the way around, and so students can invite guests. We can have exchanges there, as well as, you know, they dance outside, they study outside, we do group in check-ins and reflections outside, and so they really, really do enjoy their home away from home. So with that said, we are going to talk about community engagement, and I would like to say that in our residence in Havana is really where the community engagement begins, because it's who's inside our home that helps our students ground, boost their confidence in conversational Spanish, and give them insight to the Cuban reality, right? And so there is a community within that home that our students build, and I often find that students from past groups, past years that have traveled and studied abroad with Arcadia in Cuba come back with this very nostalgic feeling of coming back to the residence and coming back to Cuba and to the community that they built there. So with that said, community engagement, as I mentioned a little bit about my personal and professional background, is a tremendous part of our grounding and orientation to Cuba and life in Cuba. And many of you who might be on this call that have traveled to Cuba, you will know that the Cuban people are very collective. They're very solidarity. They're very welcoming to people from all over the world, including U.S. Americans and especially U.S. students, because it's an opportunity for them to share about their country and their culture and their history, and to learn more about the United States through young U.S. Americans. So starting day one, we dive into understanding the diversity within our group, our diverse lived experiences and intersecting identities, as well as kind of setting the ground for understanding how we're going to work together as a community within the home. So I use a lot of the training that I've had, and I'm so proud to say was able to participate in a workshop on popular education that was facilitated by the Cuban Martin Luther King Center that has a network of popular educators throughout the island, as well as connected with popular educators throughout the world, especially in Latin America. It really is the practice and approach of education where we are all engaged as educators, but also as co-learners. So we often critically reflect on the issues that we have at home, but that we are experiencing out in the community and throughout the journey in the semester and in the summer while they're studying abroad. So we start off our orientation as well with volunteering for shared leadership roles. So going back to health and safety, we have often 2 students that volunteer to be our health coordinators as part of their shared leadership roles in the house. Those 2 students are the ones that, you know, if it's a late night and a student's not feeling well, they can knock on the door of their health coordinator, and that health care coordinator will call me in the middle of the night, and we'll come up with a plan for that student so that we're making sure that that student's health issue is being addressed appropriately and effectively. We also integrate a lot of popular education in customizing our program and thinking about how we are going to further engage in the communities that we are exchanging with in Havana, not only on the campus, the student community, but also as well in all of the different projects and opportunities for students to explore their various interests and maybe new hobbies. So whether it's dancing, yoga, to figuring out, you know, what are the different complexities that are happening right now as Cubans are discussing and debating their updates to their constitution, right? So how do we do that? Well, it's all very, as I say, es complicado. It's complicated, right? And so we address that head on. What are some of the complexities of what we're experiencing? What are some of the complexities that students may have already pre-assumed prior to coming to Cuba because they heard it in US press, or, you know, a professor said this, or a taxi driver said that. And so breaking down the layers of complexity in Cuba and really providing exchanges to hear various perspectives and understandings of the Cuban reality. So some of the things that we do are activities to help reflect and to help build on those complexities and reflections. So one opportunity that we, and if you wouldn't mind, thanks, we do is, as you can see outside here, our patio to the far left bottom, doing some group reflection and check-ins. Students are often co-facilitating with me. So it's an opportunity for students to practice their facilitation skills, to think creatively about how they want to exchange and educate. And we also do a lot of creative activities. So in our far left corner, in the very top there, Jade is taking a cooking class, while we have a Cuban elder, an abuelita, a grandmother, telling the history of the various diasporas that have influenced Cuban cuisine. We meet with community art instructors as students are learning in the far right top corner, the Cuban rhythms. We do a walking tour of old Havana, so learning the history of colonial Havana. And then we, of course, check off our bucket list all the things that most tourists do when they want to come to Cuba, the classic car tour, but it's guided, and we're learning about the history while we're, you know, in the back seat of a convertible Chevy. So we take every opportunity to be creative, but to also learn and have fun, because that's what you have to have fun when you're in Havana and you're in Cuba, right? And also broadening our larger community. And so we meet with Cuban artists, we dance, as you see in that top middle photo. Those are a couple of our students being silly, but they performed in the International Dance Festival as part of one of the companies they were invited to participate in. Our students participate in the Latin American Film Festival. Our student in the middle photo on the bottom there, Daniel, standing up with all the Cuban students, was invited to a Cuban classroom to practice some English with some of the kids there. Cote Macao in the far left bottom there. I mentioned Cote Macao is one of the cultural art projects that we visit in the largest swamp of the Caribbean in La Ciénaga Zapata. And then we also have students take classes in their passions, right? Percussion, dance, singing, and all kinds of other creative activities. And then we also take time in nature. So you see some of the photos, which is really important, especially for our students coming from urban centers, to be able to get out in nature and to have some time to reflect and have a good time. And beyond that, also providing the possibilities and opportunities to invite Cuban students as well as US medical students studying in Cuba, the opportunities to exchange with our students. So broadening our community. So with that said, there's a lot that we covered, but we want to make sure that we have time for your questions. And so we're going to open up for a discussion now, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Great, so we're going to go through some of the questions that we've received today. The first one would be a great one for you, Angelica. It's, are there possibilities for courses in music at the University of Havana?
Great, thank you so much for that question. So they're in the Department of Arts and Letters and in other spaces, there's opportunities for a focus on Cuban film, literature, etc. However, there is not a class on Cuban music. But with that said, and I'm happy to share the link, we had a student in the spring of 2017, Sophia Logan from the University of Minnesota, who just recently shared a video with me of her experience. She's actually a student in international studies, etc., but she is a singer. And so Sophia took this semester to really immerse herself in the music and dance of Cuba. And so she was taking dance 3 times a week at the National Theater while she was actually performing live in various venues throughout Havana. She plays the guitar, and she learned, trained, and continues to self-teach herself songs from the Ifa Yoruba culture, so songs to the Orishas, which is one of the African religions in Cuba. And she is continuing her studies and discussing with me how this is like the body that of research that has just impassioned her to go on to do a PhD in ethnomusicology because of her semester in Cuba.
Great, thank you for that. Another question that we received is, how welcoming is this program to students of diverse backgrounds?
Well, that's a really important question, especially as a resident director of a diverse background myself. I will say Cuba is a very diverse nation. It is a country of many diasporas and many histories. And so students of all histories and diasporas feel very welcomed and at home in Cuba. We address issues of diversity abroad in the very beginning, whatever concerns, questions, complexities students may have. But I also provide opportunities, like I mentioned, for students, our Arcadia students, to meet with the United States students that are studying at the medical school in Cuba, which come from very diverse backgrounds, to exchange with them, to understand their stories, what drew them to the medical school in Cuba, and really to understand, as diverse young US Americans living in Cuba, committed to a 6-year program in Cuba, 6 years living in Cuba, to study medicine, there is a lot of lived experience and expertise that comes from that. And so really having those US medical students share their experience of being, diverse students in Cuba provides stories for them to understand the complexities of Cuba, but also addressing how they navigate being diverse individuals and collectives, just being abroad, not just in Cuba, but throughout the world, right?
Great, thank you. Another question that we received are there opportunities for independent study, research, internships, ways for students to engage locally?
That's an excellent question. So as I mentioned, Cuba es complicado. So Cuba is not Costa Rica or some other country where there is this history of volunteerism, to say, right? Where U.S. Students come and they work in Cuban organizations. It's much more complex than that. However, I will say that our students, and based from example, our students do deeply engage with the professors at CEHSEU. And so often I find that the students that find their topics for their midterms or their final presentations for that course, which is really a topic that they choose, that they're passionate about, that they further want to explore and investigate, they then take that topic and become really engaged with that body of research throughout the semester, summer, and then when they get back to their home countries. So it happens more organically, which is, I think where we need to go, right? Instead of this mindset that we're going to come in, we're going to help this organization. Rather, it's looking where the needs are and where things organically can form and create. Right. And so I've had students, one example, a student of mine, she is from South India, her family's from South India. And because of my community in Havana, one of my friends who is training to be an English teacher in Cuba, she's Cuban, at the institute where they train Cubans to be English teachers, she asked me to present on India. And I said, well, that's really interesting. I mean, I've been to India once, but I'm not an expert on India. And so in place of me, my student came together and she pulled together a presentation on the economy, political system, elections, culture, dance, music, language, everything on India, and presented for like nearly 2 hours because she had so many questions and answers that she was able to teach a class on India, her experiences as, a young Southern Indian woman, and the complexities of that, and teach it to Cuban students. So I, for one, about like internships and service learning, I mean, I don't see any more connection organically happening where students can really speak to who they are and their diversity and share it with other students, Cuban students in those communities. We do visit like the community at the Martin Luther King Center and other cultural projects. Often Cuban friends who are studying English want to exchange with native English speakers. So these are all opportunities for that two-way exchange to happen, which I think is so critical. And thinking through ethical and socially responsible lenses, we really need to highlight those opportunities for exchanges as well.
Perfect. I think we have time for one last question. So does Arcadia help facilitate faculty-led or custom programs in Cuba?
Well, that is the golden question. I think most faculty would love to lead a custom program to Cuba. That certainly has been my experience, and I've had the great pleasure and honor of supporting, facilitating, and designing, co-designing a number of custom-led faculty trips. However, Arcadia really, our focus and our work has been for designing and supporting and structuring our summer and semester long programs. And so while we have experience doing custom programs in Cuba, most recently in the summer of 2017, I co-led with the Martin Luther King Center a 21-day custom program. And we do have that experience. We're not in the business of short-term programs, unless, however, it has synergy with the work that we're already doing with our partners, the Center for Hemispheric United States Studies, and there's a clear connection between the themes and topics related to U.S.-Cuba relations and the areas that we feel strongly about and are committed to with our partners on the ground.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate the time you took out to learn more about our resident director Angelica and our programming in Cuba. We hope you found this informative and exciting as an opportunity for your students to engage in. Our contact information is here on the screen, so if you do have any follow-up questions, we are happy to address those, and we'll be sending a link to the recording out shortly.